Good evening and welcome back to Drift Through History. There are deals that change the terms of commerce, and there are deals that change the shape of the world. Tonight we're talking about one of the latter, a transaction concluded in Paris in the spring of 1803 between the government of Napoleon Bonaparte and two American diplomats who'd been sent to France to buy a port city and came home having bought a continent. $15 million for 828,000 square miles, roughly 3 cents an acre. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States in a single negotiation, transformed American history's entire subsequent trajectory, removed the last significant French presence from the North American mainland, and was accomplished in a matter of weeks by men who had no authority to agree to the deal they were agreeing to, and who signed it anyway, because they understood correctly that the opportunity would not come again. But the Louisiana Purchase is not, at its heart, a story about a real estate transaction. It is a story about everything that made the transaction possible, about the long, violent, complicated sequence of events on 3 continents that converged in the spring of 1803 to produce the specific conditions under which Napoleon would offer to sell and the Americans would have the courage to buy. It is a story about a revolution in the Caribbean that destroyed Napoleon's vision for an American empire and killed tens of thousands of French soldiers. It is a story about the resumption of a European war that made an ocean-spanning colonial possession a strategic liability rather than an asset. It is a story about a young republic on the western edge of the Atlantic world that was more fragile and more anxious than its subsequent history has encouraged Americans to remember, and that needed the Mississippi River the way that you need air. And it is a story about the collision of 3 of the most consequential political personalities of the age, Napoleon Bonaparte, Thomas Jefferson, and Toussaint Louverture, whose different visions for the future of the Atlantic world intersected briefly, catastrophically, and decisively in the years between 1798 and 1803. Before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the room go soft, find a comfortable position, and let your shoulders drop. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back, all the way back, to understand the world that made the Louisiana Purchase not merely possible, but, in the end, inevitable. The Atlantic world of the late 18th century was a world in motion in ways that no one living inside it could fully see or comprehend. 3 simultaneous and mutually reinforcing revolutions, the American in 1776, the French in 1789, the Haitian beginning in 1791, were rewriting the political and social possibilities of the entire Atlantic basin with a speed and a completeness that had no precedent in the history of the Western world. The ideas that these revolutions expressed and the human energies they released were not containable within the national or colonial context that had generated them. They spilled across borders and across oceans, finding audiences in places their originators had never imagined, inspiring imitations and provoking reactions that the original revolutionaries did not always welcome and could not always control. The Louisiana Purchase was, in the deepest sense, a product of this revolutionary Atlantic, of the specific way in which the forces unleashed by 3 revolutions combined and collided to produce a window of opportunity that lasted approximately 6 weeks in the spring of 1803, and then closed forever. To understand why France owned the Louisiana Territory at all, and why its ownership mattered so much to so many different parties, you have to go back to the 7 Years' War and the particular settlement it produced. But before we get to 1763, it is worth understanding what France and Britain had been competing over in North America for the preceding century, because the Louisiana Purchase was the final resolution of a conflict whose deep roots ran back to the first European settlement of the continent. New France, the French colonial enterprise in North America, was one of the most ambitious and least densely settled colonial projects in the history of European expansion. From its beginnings in the early 17th century, with the founding of Quebec in 1608, and the gradual exploration of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi watershed through the work of missionaries, fur traders and military surveyors, New France had been defined by its extraordinary geographic extent and its relatively sparse European population. At its greatest extent, New France's claimed territory ran from the Gulf of St. Lawrence through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi Valley to the Gulf of Mexico, connecting Quebec to New Orleans in an arc that enclosed the entire eastern half of the continent and hemmed the British coastal colonies between the French interior and the Atlantic Ocean. It was a brilliant piece of strategic geography and a terrible demographic reality. New France at its peak had perhaps 60,000 European inhabitants, compared to over 1 million in the British colonies. The fur trade was the economic engine of New France, and the specific character of the fur trade, which required extensive indigenous partnerships, long-distance travel through unmapped wilderness, and the maintenance of French authority over vast territories through alliance and negotiation rather than settlement, produced a colonial society very different from the agricultural plantation model of the British Atlantic seaboard. French fur traders and missionaries operated thousands of miles into the interior, developing relationships with dozens of indigenous nations, whose military and commercial cooperation was essential to the operation, and the French colonial culture that emerged from this engagement with the interior was more genuinely intercultural than the British colonial culture, which tended to push indigenous peoples aside as settlement expanded. The 7 Years' War settled the competition for North America in favour of Britain, with a comprehensiveness that the pre-war map made seem almost impossible. By 1763, Britain controlled everything east of the Mississippi, the entire former territory of New France and Canada and the eastern interior. France retained the Caribbean Sugar Islands and the theoretical claim to the Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi, which it had quietly transferred to Spain before the peace settlement to prevent it from being seized by Britain. Britain, having won the war, found itself governing an enormous, expensive and difficult North American empire that would, within 13 years, begin to fall apart. So much to so many different parties, you have to go back to the 7 Years' War and the particular settlement it produced. The 7 Years' War, which Americans know as the French and Indian War, and which is probably the best candidate for the first genuinely global conflict in history, fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. Ended in 1763 with Britain the dominant winner, France the humiliated loser, and the map of North America transformed beyond what anyone in 1754 would have predicted. France lost Canada. France lost most of its territory east of the Mississippi to Britain. And in the secret Treaty of Fontainebleau of 1762, before the main peace settlement had even been concluded, France quietly transferred the Louisiana Territory, everything west of the Mississippi, plus the city of New Orleans on its east bank, to its ally Spain, partly to compensate Spain for territories it was about to lose to Britain in the main settlement, and partly because France preferred to give Louisiana to Spain than to see it absorbed by Britain. Spain accepted Louisiana with something less than pure enthusiasm, and the 40 years of Spanish rule that followed, from 1763 to 1800, when the territory was secretly transferred back to France, were characterized by the particular kind of colonial administration that a declining power applies to a distant possession of uncertain value. The Spanish maintained the bureaucratic and administrative framework that the French had established, kept New Orleans as the territorial capital, built some new settlements along the Mississippi, and maintained a frontier relationship with the various indigenous nations whose territory the Louisiana claim encompassed on maps and barely touched in practice. The Spanish colonial hold on Louisiana was never deep. The population of European descent was small, concentrated in New Orleans and a few river towns, entirely dependent on the Mississippi River system for its commercial connections to the outside world, and governing a territory so vast that its western edges dissolved into the Great Plains and eventually into the Rocky Mountains and beyond, regions that no European administrator had ever visited, and where Spanish authority was entirely theoretical. What Louisiana represented in the strategic thinking of the European powers was not primarily its actual settled population or its modest current economic output. It was the Mississippi River. The Mississippi was the drainage system for the entire interior of the North American continent, the artery through which the agricultural production of the vast interior could reach the sea, and therefore the key to whoever controlled the economic development of North America's interior. Whoever held New Orleans held the mouth of the Mississippi. Whoever held the mouth of the Mississippi held, in a very practical sense, the economic future of anyone who tried to farm the interior of the continent. This was understood with varying degrees of clarity by all the parties whose strategic calculations intersected over Louisiana in the 1790s and early 1800s, and it was understood with particular and urgent clarity by the government of the United States, which had several million citizens living west of the Appalachian Mountains who were entirely dependent on the river system to get their goods to market. To understand Napoleon's North American vision, you first have to understand the European world in which that vision was formed, because Napoleon's interest in Louisiana was not an isolated colonial ambition, but an integral part of a larger strategic conception of how France could permanently secure its dominance of continental Europe, while also challenging the British maritime and commercial supremacy that was, in Napoleon's reading, the fundamental obstacle to French greatness. The French Revolutionary Wars that had been consuming Europe since 1792 had produced a paradoxical result. France was dominant on the continent in ways that no previous French government had achieved, and yet the war with Britain showed no sign of ending in France's favour, because the specific tools through which French dominance expressed itself, the revolutionary army, the genius of its commanders, the ideological energy of its soldiers, were land-based tools that could not reach across the Channel. The British Navy was the obstacle that French continental dominance could not overcome, and Napoleon, who understood military geography with unusual clarity, knew that the British Navy was sustained by British commercial wealth, and that British commercial wealth depended on the British position in Atlantic and global trade. To break Britain, you had to break its commerce. To break its commerce, you had to challenge its naval supremacy. To challenge its naval supremacy, you had to either build a French navy capable of matching the British fleet, an enormous investment that France's finances could not easily support, or you had to create conditions in which Britain's commercial dominance was challenged by a rival that could grow beyond what France alone could be. The continental system, the attempt to close the European continent to British goods that Napoleon would pursue systematically from 1806 onward, was one expression of this anti-British strategy. The North American vision was another, a France with a productive Caribbean sugar empire and a North American granary to support it would be an economic rival to British Atlantic trade on a scale that the British merchants and bankers who funded British military power would find genuinely threatening. A United States enlarged by French encouragement and protected by French diplomacy from British commercial pressure would be the maritime rival that Napoleon hoped would eventually exhaust British naval resources the way the Dutch and then the French had been exhausted in the previous century of Atlantic commercial competition. These were long-term strategic calculations, and Napoleon was capable of holding long-term strategic calculations alongside the immediate operational demands of the Italian campaigns and the Egyptian expedition with a facility that most of his opponents found bewildering. The France that Napoleon inherited, which is perhaps the wrong word since Napoleon took power rather than inherited it, through the coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799 that made him first consul of the French Republic and effective dictator of the most powerful state in continental Europe, was not the France of 1789. 10 years of revolution had consumed enormous human energy, generated enormous political violence, produced the Terror and the Thermidorian reaction and the Directory, and exhausted a significant portion of the French population in ways that the propaganda of the revolutionary and Napoleonic period consistently concealed. France was still at war with Britain, the war that had begun in 1793 when the revolutionary government's execution of Louis XVI shocked monarchical Europe into a coalition against the Republic, had never fully ended, though the Treaty of Amiens in March 1802 would provide a brief intermission that neither side expected to last. France was the dominant military power on the European continent, its armies having been reformed and re-energized by the revolutionary and Napoleonic years into something qualitatively different from the royal armies they had replaced, faster, more flexible, sustained by an ideology of national citizenship and revolutionary mission that the old regime's professional soldiers had never possessed. Napoleon himself was one of the most extraordinary political and military intelligences the modern world has produced, and understanding him is essential to understanding why the Louisiana Purchase happened when it happened and in the form it took. He was Corsican by birth, Italian in cultural background, French by adoption and ambition, and entirely himself in every other respect. He had risen through the artillery of the French Revolutionary Army by sheer ability, demonstrated a genius for military command at Toulon in 1793, in the Italian campaigns of 1796 and 1797, and in the Egyptian expedition of 1798 to 1799, and had then made the transition from military commander to political ruler with the same facility that suggested the two roles were, in his understanding, expressions of the same basic activity. He governed France through a combination of administrative reorganization, the Napoleonic Code, the prefectural system, the reformed finances, military dominance of continental Europe, and the force of a personality that contemporaries found simultaneously compelling and terrifying. Napoleon's vision for North America was, like most of his visions, large and specific simultaneously. He intended to restore France to the position it had occupied before the 7 Years' War, a major colonial power with a substantial Caribbean and North American presence. And he intended to use Louisiana as the agricultural base that would sustain the most profitable part of that colonial enterprise, the sugar-producing colony of Saint-Domingue. The geometry of the plan was elegant. Saint-Domingue needed food. Its entire agricultural capacity was devoted to sugar production, which meant everything else, from the flour that fed the enslaved workforce to the lumber that built the plantations, had to be imported. Louisiana, with its fertile soil and its river access to the whole interior of the continent, would be the granary of the French Caribbean Empire. New Orleans would be the entrepot through which the products of the continent's interior moved to the sea and the sugar of the Caribbean moved back inland. The whole system would make France the dominant commercial power in the Western Atlantic, providing the economic foundation for the challenge to British maritime supremacy that was Napoleon's largest strategic objective. It was a plan that might have worked. It was also a plan that depended critically on Saint-Domingue, on the continued existence and profitability of the most productive sugar colony in the world. And Saint-Domingue was already, by the time Napoleon was assembling his North American vision, in a condition that made its continued profitability deeply uncertain. The reason was a revolution that had been burning for a decade, and that was about to make everything Napoleon intended impossible. Saint-Domingue occupied the western third of the island of Hispaniola, the same island that Columbus had first landed on in 1492, and whose indigenous Taino population the Spanish had destroyed in the decades of early colonization. The French had established their presence in the western part of the island in the second half of the 17th century. From a base at Tortuga, in fact, the same buccaneer island we have discussed on this channel, and by the late 18th century had transformed it into the most productive plantation colony in the history of the Atlantic world. By 1789, Saint-Domingue produced approximately half of all the sugar consumed in Europe and roughly 40% of Europe's coffee, making it more commercially valuable than all of the 13 American colonies combined had been at the eve of the American Revolution. Its population of approximately 550,000 people was divided into roughly 40,000 white colonists, 30,000 free people of colour, most of them of mixed African and European ancestry, many of them substantial property owners, and 480,000 enslaved people of African origin, living and dying in conditions of systematic brutality that sustained the colony's extraordinary productivity at a cost in human suffering whose scale defies easy comprehension. The French Revolution's ideas about liberty and equality landed on Saint-Domingue with results that the Revolution's architects had not anticipated and did not welcome. The free people of colour, many of whom were educated, wealthy, and deeply familiar with Enlightenment philosophy, immediately demanded the political rights that the Declaration of the Rights of Man seemed to promise them. The white planter class, who depended on the racial hierarchy for their social position, and who feared the implications of any extension of political rights to non-white people, refused. The French National Assembly, trying to manage the situation from Paris at a distance of thousands of miles with inadequate information and contradictory political pressures, produced a series of responses that satisfied no one and inflamed everyone. Into this political crisis in August 1791, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue rose in an uprising of a scale and ferocity that the colony's entire history of enslaved resistance had been building toward. The uprising began in the northern province, where an enslaved man named Dutty Boukman led a ceremony at Bois Caïman on the night of August 14th, 1791. A ceremony whose specific details have been embellished and disputed over 2 centuries, but whose immediate practical consequence was the coordination of a large-scale simultaneous uprising across the northern plain. Within days, hundreds of sugar plantations were burning. Within weeks, tens of thousands of people had died on both sides. Within months, it was clear that this was not a revolt that could be suppressed by the colonial militia and the small French garrison, but a revolution, the largest and most successful slave revolution in the history of the Atlantic world, that would eventually produce the first Black Republic in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The Haitian Revolution's significance in the Atlantic world extended far beyond its military and diplomatic dimensions, and the specific terror it inspired in the slaveholding classes of the Americas, a terror that shaped American policy toward Haiti for decades, and that affected the Louisiana Purchase debate in ways that American historians have only recently begun to fully examine, is essential to understanding the full political context of what Jefferson was managing in 1801 to 1803. The news that hundreds of thousands of enslaved people in Saint-Domingue had risen, killed their enslavers, burned the plantations, and were winning, actually winning, their war for freedom against a European colonial power reached the slaveholding societies of the Americas with the force of the thing they had always most feared. American slaveholders in Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia, who had persuaded themselves that the enslaved people around them were either content or too controlled to revolt effectively, found the image of Saint-Domingue, the burning plantations, the plantation owner families fleeing to American ports, the French army being destroyed by fighters who had been slaves, a direct challenge to every reassuring story they had told themselves about the institution on which their wealth and their social order rested. The Gabriel Prosser conspiracy of 1800 in Virginia, in which an enslaved blacksmith organized a planned uprising in Richmond that was revealed before it could be executed, heightened the anxiety of Virginia slaveholders at exactly the moment when Jefferson was taking office. The connection between the Haitian Revolution and the domestic threat of slave revolt was not a theoretical concern. It was the central political anxiety of the slaveholding South. Jefferson was himself a slaveholder, the owner of more than 100 enslaved people at Monticello, a man whose relationship to the institution of slavery was one of the most intellectually and morally contorted in American history, combining genuine intellectual condemnation of slavery as incompatible with the Republic's founding ideals, with a complete practical inability to imagine a social order in which it did not exist. His response to the Haitian Revolution was shaped by this contradiction in ways that made his Louisiana policy more complicated than the simple story of a president seeking commercial access to the Mississippi can capture. Jefferson and his administration provided some assistance to the Leclerc expedition against Toussaint, not the direct military support that France requested, but the tacit cooperation of allowing American merchants to supply the French forces, partly because a successful French restoration of order in Saint-Domingue would eliminate the revolutionary example on the southern doorstep of the American slaveholding states, and partly because Jefferson genuinely preferred a French-controlled Saint-Domingue to a free black republic independent of European control. The irony was total. The revolution that Jefferson feared for its implications for American slavery was the revolution that destroyed Napoleon's Louisiana project and made the Louisiana Purchase possible. Jefferson's ambivalence about Haiti, his refusal to recognize the Haitian Republic, his maintenance of a commercial embargo against the new state that would last into the following decade, was itself a product of the contradiction between the Republican ideals that the Declaration of Independence expressed and the slaveholding social order that Jefferson's personal, political and economic life depended on. He bought Louisiana because Haiti made it available. He refused to acknowledge Haiti because acknowledging it was politically and ideologically impossible in a republic where the slaveholding interest was a fundamental pillar of the governing coalition. The man who transformed the Haitian Revolution from a great uprising into a political achievement was Toussaint Louverture, and he is one of the most remarkable figures in the history of any revolution anywhere. He had been born enslaved around 1743 on the Breda plantation in the northern province, had learned to read and write, an unusual achievement for an enslaved person in Saint-Domingue, had been given some degree of responsibility and autonomy by his enslaver, and had spent his adult life developing the combination of military, political, and administrative intelligence that the revolution would eventually reveal. He was approximately 48 years old when the uprising began in 1791, and he joined the rebel forces in the northern province with a group of followers, displaying from the beginning the military ability and the strategic thinking that would make him the revolution's dominant figure. Toussaint's career across the decade from 1791 to 1801 was one of extraordinary complexity and equally extraordinary achievement. He fought for Spain against France in the early years of the Revolution. Spain, which controlled the eastern portion of Hispaniola, saw the uprising as an opportunity to weaken its French rival and offered freedom and military rank to enslaved people who would fight under Spanish command. Then, in May 1794, Toussaint switched sides to France, bringing his well-trained and battle-hardened force of several thousand men with him, in response to the French National Convention's abolition of slavery in the French colonies, the most radical act of the revolutionary period, which Toussaint correctly identified as the best guarantee of the freedom he was fighting for. He spent the remainder of the decade fighting for France against the British expedition that occupied significant portions of Saint-Domingue from 1793 to 1798, building an army of formerly enslaved people into one of the most effective fighting forces in the Caribbean, and gradually consolidating his political control over the colony to the point where, by 1800, he was effectively its ruler in all but name. The British expedition against Saint-Domingue, which ran from 1793 to 1798, deserves some specific attention because it was one of the most catastrophic military failures in British imperial history, and because its failure was directly relevant to the subsequent French expedition that would trigger the Louisiana Purchase. The British had invaded Saint-Domingue with approximately 4,000 men in 1793, intending to take advantage of the revolutionary chaos to seize the most valuable colony in the Caribbean. Over the following 5 years, they sent reinforcements repeatedly as the initial force was consumed by yellow fever, guerrilla warfare, and the increasingly effective military operations of Toussaint's forces. By the time the British finally evacuated in 1798, they had lost approximately 25,000 men to disease and combat, a casualty rate that would have been shocking in any conventional military campaign, and that was absolutely devastating in a colonial operation that had never attracted strong domestic support. The lesson of the British expedition, that Saint-Domingue was a military death trap for European armies, that the combination of tropical disease and a highly motivated local resistance was lethal to any conventional force, was there to be learned from the British experience. Napoleon, characteristically, did not learn it. The Convention of Montfonteille, signed in September 1800, formally ended the quasi-war, the undeclared naval conflict between the United States and France that had been simmering since 1798, and that had brought the two countries closer to formal war than most Americans have subsequently remembered. The quasi-war, as it came to be called, was itself a product of the intertwining of European and American politics in the Revolutionary period, and understanding it is essential to understanding the political context in which the Louisiana Purchase would be negotiated. The United States had emerged from its own revolution with an admiration for France, the nation that had supported American independence against Britain, whose own revolution had been inspired in part by the American example, that the excesses of the French Revolution had progressively complicated. The execution of Louis XVI, the Terror, the emergence of the Directory and its aggressive foreign policy, and above all the French decree that American ships trading with Britain were subject to seizure, a decree that treated American neutrality as non-existent and American commerce as fair game for French privateers, had poisoned the Franco-American relationship with a thoroughness that the XYZ affair of 1797 then made dramatically public. The XYZ affair was, in its way, one of the more diplomatically brazen episodes in the history of French foreign policy. President John Adams had sent a diplomatic mission to France in 1797 to negotiate an end to the maritime conflict and repair the strained relationship between the two republics. 3 French agents, identified in the American report as X, Y, and Z to spare the embarrassment of naming them, met the American envoys and demanded a bribe of $250,000 as a precondition for any negotiation, plus an American loan to France of millions more. The American envoys refused. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney's reported response, "millions for defence but not 1 cent for tribute," was the kind of phrase that political legend requires to have been said exactly that way, whether it was or not, and the affair, when it became public, generated in the United States the kind of furious national indignation that French foreign policy had apparently not anticipated. Congress authorized the expansion of the Navy, the creation of the Marine Corps as a separate service, and the abrogation of the treaties of alliance and commerce that had connected the United States to France since the American Revolution. The quasi-war at sea followed, with American and French naval vessels fighting encounters in the Caribbean that were tactically limited but politically significant. The Convention of Mortefontaine ended the Quasi-War and also ended the French-American alliance that had been the diplomatic foundation of American independence. Both sides got something from the arrangement. The United States got an end to French seizures of American shipping, and France got the formal severance of the alliance that had committed America to France's defence, which Napoleon, who was already thinking about the Louisiana scheme, found convenient rather than troubling. He wanted American trade and American neutrality. He did not need or want American military commitments. The convention was negotiated on the French side by Napoleon's brother Joseph, and its conclusion freed both sides to pursue the projects that would shortly collide. The Treaty of San Ildefonso, signed in October 1800, 1 month after the Convention of Mortefontaine, was the document that transferred Louisiana back to France. It was secret. Napoleon had been negotiating it with Spain for years, and the final terms gave Spain the Kingdom of Etruria, a new Italian state created from territories Napoleon controlled, in exchange for Louisiana and nominally Spanish Florida, though the Florida provision was ambiguous enough that both sides subsequently disputed what it meant. The Spanish Prime Minister Godoy, who had negotiated the treaty, reportedly described it afterward as one of the worst deals Spain had ever made, a judgment that history has largely confirmed. Spain was trading a large but underdeveloped North American territory for an Italian kingdom that Napoleon would eventually revoke anyway, and in doing so was removing the buffer between France and the United States that Spain's weakness as a colonial power had provided, and that France's strength made genuinely threatening. The secrecy of San Ildefonso did not last long, in a world where diplomatic correspondence was routinely intercepted, read, and shared. By the spring of 1801, Thomas Jefferson, newly inaugurated as the third President of the United States, was receiving reports from American diplomats and intelligence sources in Europe, suggesting that the retrocession had occurred or was about to occur, and the reports alarmed him in ways that he expressed with unusual directness for a man whose political communication was normally more careful. His letter to Robert Livingston, the American minister in Paris, written in April 1802, is one of the most candid statements of American strategic anxiety in the early Republic's history. There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans. Before we can fully understand Jefferson's alarm, we need to understand the republic he was governing and how much more fragile it was than American national mythology has subsequently represented it. The United States of 1801 was 25 years old and had been a functioning constitutional government for only 12. It had already survived one constitutional crisis, the contested election of 1800, in which Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr tied in the Electoral College, and the decision fell to the Federalist-dominated House of Representatives, which took 36 ballots before electing Jefferson, that had raised genuine questions about whether the constitutional system was stable enough to manage contested transfers of power. Its first president had already established the precedent of voluntary retirement from power after 2 terms, but the precedent was just that, a precedent established by one man's decision, not a constitutional requirement, and its permanence could not be assumed. The army was small and under-equipped by European standards. The navy, which John Adams had substantially expanded and whose performance in the Quasi-War against France had been creditable, was in the process of being reduced by Jefferson's fiscal conservatism to a force barely adequate for coastal defence. The political division between the Federalists, who broadly favoured a strong central government, a professional military, close commercial ties with Britain, and a sceptical view of democratic enthusiasm, and the Democratic Republicans, who broadly favoured states' rights, limited federal power, agrarian social organisation, and sympathy for the French revolutionary project was not merely a disagreement about policy. It was a disagreement about the fundamental nature of the American Republic that was fought out in terms so bitter and so personal that the participants sometimes used language that suggested they did not consider their opponents legitimate participants in the political system. Hamilton and Jefferson, who had served together in Washington's cabinet and who disagreed about practically everything, conducted a political conflict across the 1790s that produced the two-party system and that also produced, along the way, some of the most vitriolic political writing in American history. Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which made it a crime to criticize the government, and which Jefferson and Madison responded to with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, asserting the right of states to nullify federal legislation they considered unconstitutional, were expressions of a political conflict that had not fully resolved itself when Jefferson took office in 1801. The foreign policy dimension of this domestic conflict was particularly acute, because the two parties had different foreign patrons as well as different domestic visions. The Federalists looked toward Britain, toward the commercial relationship with British merchants and British capital that the Atlantic economy of the period made practically important, and toward the constitutional model of limited government and strong executive that Federalist political theory drew from British experience. The Democratic Republicans looked toward France, toward the revolutionary ideals that had been expressed simultaneously in Paris and Philadelphia, toward the vision of a republic of free farmers that Jefferson had made the ideological centre of his political thought, toward the commercial and diplomatic alliance with France that had made American independence possible in the first place. When the French Revolution descended into the Terror and Napoleon's coup replaced the Directory with a military dictatorship, the Democratic Republicans' relationship to France became more complicated, but the fundamental orientation remained. Jefferson's alarm was not rhetorical. It was grounded in a specific and well-founded understanding of what the American economy required and what French control of New Orleans would mean for it. The United States of 1801 was not the continental power that the Louisiana Purchase would eventually make it. It was a coastal republic of approximately 5 million people, roughly the same population as Scotland at the time, clustered along the eastern seaboard, with a rapidly growing interior population that had crossed the Appalachian Mountains and was pushing into the Ohio Valley, Tennessee, Kentucky, and the territories beyond. These interior communities were economically dependent on the Mississippi River system in a way that has no modern parallel that accurately captures the urgency of the dependence. There were no railroads. There were no improved roads through the mountains capable of handling heavy agricultural freight. The river was not merely the most convenient route to market. For most Western farmers, it was the only route to market that made commercial agriculture economically viable. The produce of the Western settlements, the corn and pork and tobacco and hemp that farms along the Ohio and the Tennessee and the Cumberland were producing in increasing quantities as settlement expanded, was floated down the river system on flatboats to New Orleans, transferred to ocean-going vessels and shipped to markets on the eastern seaboard and in the Caribbean. New Orleans was the funnel through which the entire economic output of the American interior passed on its way to the world, and whoever controlled New Orleans controlled, in a very practical sense, the economic lifeline of a third of the American population. When Spain held New Orleans, this was manageable. Spain was a declining power with no particular interest in using its commercial position at the mouth of the Mississippi as a strategic weapon against the United States, and the Pinckney Treaty of 1795 had secured for American commerce the right of deposit at New Orleans, the right to transfer goods from river boats to ocean-going vessels without paying Spanish customs duties. When France held New Orleans, the calculation was entirely different. Napoleon was not a declining power with limited strategic ambitions. He was the most aggressive and capable strategic actor in the Atlantic world, and a France that controlled the mouth of the Mississippi was a France that controlled the economic life of the American interior. The specific crisis that converted Jefferson's general anxiety into urgent action was Napoleon's suspension of the American right of deposit at New Orleans in October 1802. The suspension was ordered by the Spanish intendant Juan Ventura Morales, and may have been, to some degree, an independent action rather than a Napoleonic directive. The question of whether Napoleon directly ordered the suspension, or whether it was the result of Spanish officials acting in accordance with their own interpretation of what French ownership of Louisiana implied, has been argued by historians without definitive resolution. What was not arguable was the effect. Western American farmers who had been shipping their goods through New Orleans and were suddenly denied the legal right to do so were furious, and that fury expressed itself in political pressure on Jefferson's administration to do something about the situation. The Federalists in Congress, who had never shared Jefferson's enthusiasm for France or his skepticism about the need for a stronger federal government and a larger military establishment, called for military action to seize New Orleans by force. Jefferson, who was deeply committed to avoiding European-style wars and deeply skeptical of the military establishment that such wars would require, needed a diplomatic solution. He sent James Monroe to Paris with authorization to negotiate. The man Monroe was going to negotiate with was not the same Napoleon who had signed the Treaty of San Ildefonso and dreamed of a French empire in North America 2 years earlier. The intervening years had been the years of Saint-Domingue, and what had happened there between 1801 and 1803 had destroyed Napoleon's American vision as completely as any military defeat could have done it, at a cost in French lives that was one of the great unacknowledged catastrophes of the Napoleonic period. In January 1801, Toussaint Louverture had issued a constitution for Saint-Domingue that made him governor for life of the colony, with effectively sovereign powers, acknowledged formal French sovereignty only nominally, and made no provision for the restoration of the plantation economy in the form that had made Saint-Domingue profitable before 1791. Toussaint governed the colony with considerable ability. He restored agricultural production through a system of compulsory labour on the plantations that was not slavery, but was coercive, maintained order, reopened trade, and attempted to attract the investment and the expertise that the destroyed plantation infrastructure would need to recover. He was also aware, with the acute political intelligence that had characterized his entire career, that Napoleon's North American plans required Saint-Domingue, and that a Saint-Domingue that was effectively independent under his governance was an obstacle to those plans that Napoleon would eventually move to remove. Napoleon's response, when it came, was the largest military expedition the French had ever sent to the Caribbean. In December 1801, a fleet of approximately 86 ships carrying between 20 and 30,000 French soldiers, commanded by Napoleon's brother-in-law General Charles Leclerc, arrived at Cap Français in northern Saint-Domingue. The instructions Leclerc carried were, in their essential substance, a plan for the destruction of what Toussaint had built and the restoration of the colonial order that had made Saint-Domingue profitable before 1791, which meant, necessarily, the restoration of slavery, though this was not stated explicitly in the initial phase of the operation, because Napoleon understood that stating it explicitly would guarantee the resistance of every formerly enslaved person on the island. The campaign that followed was one of the most brutal in the long history of European colonial warfare, and its outcome was the most complete defeat that a Napoleonic military force suffered anywhere during the entire Napoleonic period. Leclerc's army arrived in overwhelming force, but the circumstances it encountered, the heat, the tropical diseases, the terrain, and above all the military effectiveness and the motivated resistance of the Haitian forces, were circumstances that no European military experience had prepared it for. Toussaint initially attempted to negotiate, then withdrew into the mountains and fought a guerrilla campaign that inflicted heavy casualties on the French, while yellow fever began its systematic work on an army whose bodies had no immunity to the disease that Haitian fighters had long since developed. The specific tactics that Leclerc and his officers used to deal with Toussaint were as dishonourable as they were strategically counterproductive. Toussaint was lured into negotiations under a flag of truce, arrested in violation of the safe conduct that had been offered, transported to France, and imprisoned in Fort de Joux in the Jura Mountains, where he died in April 1803, of cold and neglect, and the particular cruelty of a tropical man imprisoned in an Alpine fortress in the middle of the European winter. His arrest did not end the resistance, it intensified it. When word spread through the Haitian resistance forces that the French had arrested Toussaint under a flag of truce, any possibility of a negotiated settlement disappeared. The resistance committed itself to total war under new leaders, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Henri Christophe, Alexandre Pétion, who drew the same conclusion from Toussaint's treatment that the evidence warranted, that the French intended the elimination of the black leadership class of Saint-Domingue, the reimposition of slavery, and the restoration of the plantation order, and that the only possible response was absolute resistance. Meanwhile, yellow fever was doing what French military force could not accomplish against the Haitian resistance. The disease killed European soldiers with a thoroughness and a speed that had made the same territory lethal to the British expedition a decade before. Leclerc himself died of yellow fever in November 1802, replaced by General Rochambeau, who had the tactical imagination to respond to a failing military campaign by escalating the atrocities, drowning prisoners, unleashing dogs specially imported from Cuba to hunt human beings, conducting massacres of captured fighters with a systematic brutality that the historical record documents with appalling specificity, and that achieved nothing except to deepen the determination of the Haitian resistance. By the spring of 1803, the French position in Saint-Domingue was not failing, it was destroyed. Of the original 20,000 to 30,000 men who had arrived with Leclerc's expedition, approximately 50,000 French soldiers had been sent to Saint-Domingue by that point, as the casualty losses required reinforcement, and the great majority of them were dead, from yellow fever above all, from combat, from the slow attrition of a campaign that was failing on every dimension. The colony that had been the most profitable in the Atlantic world was rubble and ashes. Napoleon's vision for a French empire in the Western Hemisphere was over, and with Saint-Domingue gone, Louisiana had lost the strategic purpose that had justified the effort of acquiring it. There was no longer a granary needed because there was no longer a Caribbean empire to feed. The news from Saint-Domingue was not the only thing concentrating Napoleon's attention in the spring of 1803. The Peace of Amiens, signed in March 1802, had provided a brief and uneasy respite from the war with Britain that had been consuming French resources since 1793. Both sides had accepted the treaty with reservations, Britain because it needed time to recover from the financial strain of a decade of warfare, France because Napoleon had plans that required a period of peace to implement. Both sides also understood, with varying degrees of explicit acknowledgement, that the peace was temporary. The specific questions that had generated the war in the first place, the fate of the revolutionary Netherlands, the future of Italy, the question of Malta, the expansion of French commercial and colonial influence, had not been resolved by the treaty, only deferred, and the deferral was running out. Britain's perspective on the Louisiana question is one that the standard American narrative of the purchase largely ignores, but it was a perspective that shaped events in ways that the American government both understood and depended upon. The British government under Addington in 1803, and under the elder Pitt, who replaced him in 1804, was watching the Louisiana situation with an attention that the strategic implications demanded. A France that controlled the Mississippi Valley, was a France positioned to threaten both the British Caribbean possessions and the growing American commercial relationship with Britain that was one of the primary sources of British export revenue. A France that had succeeded in Saint-Domingue and established the North American granary that Napoleon intended would have been a commercial competitor of the first order in the Atlantic trade that Britain regarded as its own domain. The British had reasons, therefore, to welcome the Louisiana Purchase that went beyond the simple calculation of keeping France off the North American continent. An American Louisiana was commercially accessible to British merchants in ways that a French Louisiana would not be. The commercial relationship between the United States and Britain, whatever the political friction of the post-independence period, was economically intimate in ways that neither side could entirely avoid. American cotton and tobacco and agricultural products moved to British markets. British manufactured goods moved to American consumers. The financial houses of London provided much of the capital that American commercial expansion required. A larger, more prosperous, more commercially active United States was, from the British commercial point of view, a larger and more prosperous customer. The British did not, however, simply stand aside from the Louisiana situation. The British government communicated to both Napoleon and to the American government, through various channels that the diplomatic correspondence of the period partially preserves, its view that a French Louisiana was unacceptable, and that British naval power would be available to prevent it if necessary. This implicit British threat, the understanding that a war with Britain would result in the immediate vulnerability of Louisiana to British seizure, was one of the factors in Napoleon's calculation, and it worked in the Americans' favour in a way that Jefferson acknowledged in private correspondence, though not in public, because acknowledging that American diplomacy had been assisted by British military power would have been politically impossible for a president whose party had been founded partly in opposition to the pro-British orientation of the Federalists. The specific issue of Malta was the immediate occasion for the breakdown of the Peace of Amiens. Britain had agreed in the treaty to evacuate Malta, the island in the central Mediterranean that it had taken from the Knights of St. John during the war, and whose strategic position at the centre of Mediterranean trade routes made it extremely valuable. Britain delayed the evacuation and then refused to complete it, citing various French provocations as justification, Napoleon's continued interference in the Italian republics, and his commercial treaty with the Ottoman Empire being among the most pressing. Napoleon, for his part, was not making the maintenance of the peace easy for those in Britain who wanted it. His annexation of Elba and Piedmont, his reorganisation of the Cisalpine and Ligurian republics, his interference in Swiss internal affairs, all of these were actions that the more hawkish elements of British political opinion, including Prime Minister Addington and his successor Pitt, found incompatible with the peaceful coexistence the treaty was supposed to represent. By April 1803, the same weeks during which Monroe was arriving in Paris, and Napoleon was calculating what to do with Louisiana, the renewal of the war was a matter of weeks rather than months. The British ambassador was exchanging communications with the foreign ministry at a pace that suggested finality rather than negotiation. Napoleon knew, as he had known since acquiring Louisiana, that a renewed war with Britain meant a renewed operation of British naval power in the Western Atlantic, and that a renewed British naval presence in the Western Atlantic meant that Louisiana would be vulnerable to exactly the kind of seizure that the British had attempted against Saint-Domingue in 1793. The British Navy, which had demonstrated at Trafalgar 2 years later exactly what it was capable of, but whose capabilities were already well understood by anyone who'd been paying attention to the previous decade of Atlantic warfare, could almost certainly take New Orleans if it chose to. France had no naval force in the Western Atlantic capable of preventing it, and a British Louisiana was strategically far worse for Napoleon's continental ambitions than an American one. The United States was weak but relatively neutral and potentially hostile to Britain. Britain in Louisiana was Britain on the doorstep of the American interior, which was the last thing Napoleon's vision of the Atlantic balance of power required. The financial dimension was equally pressing. Napoleon was going to war again. Wars, as every European ruler of the period understood with painful clarity, cost money in quantities that no peacetime revenue base could supply, and the methods of obtaining wartime finance, borrowing from the banking houses, extracting contributions from occupied territories, the specific financial mechanisms of the Napoleonic state, all required a base of assets and creditworthiness that the abandoned Caribbean empire was no longer providing. $15 million in American funds, arriving relatively quickly and in a negotiable form, was a meaningful injection of liquidity into a financial situation that was about to get considerably more complicated. The specific drama of the Louisiana negotiation unfolded in Paris over a period of weeks in April and May of 1803 that must have had a surreal quality for the men at the centre of it. But to understand the specific drama, you need to understand the months and years of diplomatic frustration that preceded it, because the sudden reversal that produced the offer of the entire territory was so unexpected that Livingston, who had been trying for 15 months to get a serious conversation about New Orleans, initially struggled to believe what he was hearing. The French foreign ministry in the Napoleonic period was presided over by Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, who is one of the most fascinating figures in the political history of the 19th century, and one of the most difficult to characterize honestly, because his facility for serving whatever government was in power at any given moment. The Ancien Regime, the Revolution, the Directory, the Consulate, the Empire, the Restoration, and eventually the July Monarchy, seemed to suggest either a complete absence of personal conviction or a complete mastery of political survival, and the evidence supports both interpretations simultaneously. He had been a bishop before the Revolution and a diplomat for every government after it. He had negotiated the Treaty of San Ildefonso on Napoleon's behalf. He had accepted bribes from every party with which he was conducting negotiations, which the XYZ affair had revealed to American embarrassment, and which Talleyrand had managed with the brazenness of a man who considered payment for services rendered to be a normal feature of diplomatic practice. He was also, despite all of this, a genuinely brilliant diplomat whose instinct for the politically possible was more reliable than that of almost any of the principals he served. Talleyrand's role in the Louisiana negotiation is somewhat mysterious, because the decision to offer the full territory was Napoleon's, made without Talleyrand's specific advice and possibly against Talleyrand's own inclinations. Talleyrand in later years suggested that he had opposed the sale, preferring to use Louisiana as a long-term strategic asset, but this retrospective claim cannot be fully credited from a man whose retrospective accounts of his own positions were consistently shaped by his assessment of what would make him look best in posterity. What is clear is that when Napoleon gave the direction to offer Louisiana, Talleyrand conveyed it to Livingston in a way calculated to produce the desired response. The casual, apparently offhand question that dropped the possibility of the full territory into the conversation as if it were a minor variation on the New Orleans discussion, when in fact it was the most consequential real estate offer in the history of the Americas. In April and May of 1803, that must have had a surreal quality for the men at the centre of it. Robert Livingston had been in Paris since December 1801, negotiating patiently and largely fruitlessly for the purchase of New Orleans and West Florida, the specific thing that Jefferson had instructed him to acquire. He was a man of considerable personal distinction. He had administered the oath of office to George Washington, had been one of the 5-member committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence, and considerable diplomatic frustration, having spent 15 months trying to get a serious response from the French Foreign Ministry on the New Orleans question, and having gotten mostly evasions. The French had not wanted to discuss selling New Orleans, because their entire Louisiana policy was predicated on keeping it. As long as Napoleon intended to use Louisiana as the foundation of a North American empire, selling any part of it to the United States was contrary to the plan. What changed in April 1803 was Napoleon's decision, apparently taken in the last days of March, to sell Louisiana entirely and abandon the North American project. The specific moment at which Napoleon made this decision is one of those historical questions where the evidence is insufficient to allow certainty, but the outlines are clear. By the time Livingston sat down to a meeting with the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand on April 11th, 1803, the conversation had shifted in a way that Livingston had not expected. Instead of the usual evasions about New Orleans, Talleyrand asked, casually, as if the thought had just occurred to him, whether the United States might be interested in purchasing the entire territory of Louisiana. Livingston, whatever he felt internally, responded with the controlled diplomatic interest that the situation required. The price was the immediate issue. Napoleon had instructed his Treasury Minister Babé Marbois, who was conducting the actual financial negotiations with Livingston, while Talleyrand handled the political dimensions, to seek 80 million francs, approximately $15 million at the exchange rates of the period. The initial American offer was 50 million francs, plus the assumption of French debts to American citizens. The final agreement, reached across several days of intense negotiation in which both parties understood the urgency that the approaching war imposed, was 60 million francs plus 20 million more for the American debt claims, 72 million francs in total, approximately $15 million, which included the debt cancellations as well as the cash payment. James Monroe arrived in Paris on April 12, 1803, the day after Talleyrand's opening question to Livingston, the timing almost exactly right for him to participate in the negotiation he had been sent to conduct, but just slightly too late for him to have been there for the first moment of opportunity. The two Americans, working together, concluded the treaty on May 2nd, 1803. It was officially dated April 30th. The authorization problem was one that both men were acutely aware of throughout the negotiation. Jefferson had sent Monroe to Paris with authorization to spend up to $10 million for New Orleans and West Florida, with some flexibility for a better deal. The Louisiana Purchase was $15 million for an area more than 4 times the size of the 13 original states, and it included no explicit authorization from Congress or even from Jefferson himself for a purchase of this magnitude. The Constitution said nothing about the acquisition of territory through purchase, and Jefferson, who was a strict constructionist in his constitutional philosophy and who had spent much of the 1790s arguing that the federal government had no powers beyond those explicitly granted by the Constitution, was genuinely uncomfortable with the constitutional question. He drafted an amendment to the Constitution that would authorize the Louisiana Purchase after the fact, and then, when his advisers and Monroe explained that the window of opportunity was narrow, that Napoleon might withdraw the offer if Congress delayed, and that the French were already expressing second thoughts, he decided to proceed and deal with the constitutional question afterward. The second thoughts that Jefferson's advisers were worried about were real. The Treaty of San Ildefonso, which had transferred Louisiana from Spain to France, included provisions that prohibited France from transferring the territory to any third party, a provision that Spain had insisted on and that Napoleon had accepted without intending to honour, because the specific clause he had agreed to committed France not to alienate Louisiana to a third power. And Napoleon's interpretation of this was that the United States, having accepted his cession, was not a third power in the relevant sense, but simply the new owner. Spain protested that the sale was illegal under the terms of San Ildefonso. Napoleon's response was essentially that Spain could complain as loudly as it wished, but that the sale was complete. The United States, which had just doubled in size and was not going to return the purchase on procedural grounds, agreed. Spain's protests were noted and disregarded. Napoleon himself, when it was all done, expressed a satisfaction with the outcome that went beyond the financial terms. He told his Treasury Minister that the cession of Louisiana had strengthened America, weakened England, and perhaps laid the foundation for the maritime rival that he hoped would eventually challenge British commercial and naval dominance. He was thinking, characteristically, at a level of strategic abstraction that most of his contemporaries found difficult to match. Whether his prediction was accurate, whether the United States eventually became the maritime rival to Britain that he foresaw, is a question that the subsequent 2 centuries have answered in a qualified yes, though not quite in the form Napoleon had imagined, because the United States would eventually challenge British dominance not by opposing Britain, but by replacing it. The formal transfer of Louisiana to the United States took place in ceremonies at New Orleans in November and December of 1803. The French flag flew over New Orleans for approximately 20 days between the Spanish handover and the American assumption of sovereignty. Spain had only formally relinquished control in November, having held on to it while its protests about the legality of the sale were being ignored, and giving the territory the distinction of having changed hands twice within a month. The American territorial governor, William Claiborne, and the military commander, General James Wilkinson, accepted the transfer on behalf of the United States in a ceremony at the Place d'Armes on December 20th, 1803. The Louisiana Territory was now American. What the United States had purchased was, at the time of the purchase, not well known even to the government that had bought it. The boundaries of Louisiana were deliberately left vague in the treaty because both the French and the Americans preferred vagueness to the specific limitations that clearly defined borders would have imposed. The treaty described the territory as having the same extent it had in the hands of Spain, and as France had received it, a circular definition that said nothing useful about where exactly the boundaries were, and that was understood by both parties to be a description of a political arrangement rather than a geographic one. The western boundary with Spanish-held Mexico was completely undefined, and would be the subject of contentious negotiation for years. The northern boundary with British Canada was fuzzy. The question of whether the purchase included West Florida, the strip of Gulf Coast territory between the Mississippi and the Perdido River, which Spain claimed separately, and which France had apparently agreed to include in the retrocession, but had then excluded from the sale, generated a decade of diplomatic argument. The land itself, beyond the relatively settled portions near New Orleans and along the lower Mississippi, was unknown to American geography in ways that Jefferson was determined to rectify. The Lewis and Clark expedition, which departed from Camp Dubois near Saintes, Louis in May 1804 and returned in September 1806, having travelled to the Pacific coast and back, was the most famous of the several expeditions that Jefferson organised to explore the acquired territory and its results. The detailed journals and maps that Lewis and Clark and their colleagues produced, the natural history specimens, the records of the indigenous nations they encountered, were the beginning of the American government's systematic knowledge of what it had bought. The territory they travelled through was not empty, of course. It was home to dozens of native nations, the Sioux, the Mandan, the Arikara, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, and many others, whose sovereignty the Louisiana Purchase had not consulted, and whose existence in the territory the treaty had not acknowledged. The purchase was a transaction between France and the United States about land that neither France nor the United States actually controlled in any meaningful sense beyond the river towns of Louisiana and the theoretical claims of sovereignty that European colonial law recognized and indigenous reality consistently defied. This is the dimension of the Louisiana Purchase that the celebratory national narrative has most consistently struggled with, and it deserves direct acknowledgement rather than footnote treatment. The $50 million transferred legal title to 828,000 square miles of land, but the legal title that was transferred had been constructed through the European doctrine of discovery, the claim that Christian European sovereigns could claim sovereignty over territories they reached before other Christian European sovereigns, regardless of what the people already living in those territories thought about the matter. The indigenous nations of the Louisiana Territory had not been party to the Treaty of Fontainebleau, or the Treaty of San Ildefonso, or the Louisiana Purchase Treaty. Their existence in the territory had not made those treaties legally impossible under the international law of the period, which did not recognize indigenous sovereignty in the same sense that it recognized the sovereignty of European states. What the Louisiana Purchase purchased was the right to claim those territories from other European powers, a right that the United States would subsequently translate into the specific and systematic dispossession of the indigenous peoples who actually lived there, through a combination of treaty-making, military force, and demographic pressure that consumed the remainder of the 19th century. Jefferson's constitutional anxiety about the purchase was not purely philosophical. He genuinely believed that the Constitution did not grant the federal government the power to acquire territory, and he spent several weeks in the summer of 1803 drafting constitutional amendments that would retroactively authorize what had already been done. He eventually abandoned the amendment approach when his political allies, and more pressingly the practical situation, made clear that waiting for the amendment process would either lose the opportunity or give Napoleon's second thoughts time to develop into a formal withdrawal. He proceeded with the purchase on the basis of the treaty power and his own executive authority, swallowing the constitutional inconsistency with the pragmatism that actual political responsibility tends to impose on abstract philosophical commitments. The Senate ratified the Louisiana Purchase Treaty on October 20th, 1803, by a vote of 26-6. The Federalists who opposed it did so on constitutional grounds, and on the specific argument that incorporating such a vast territory with such a varied population, the approximately 50,000 residents of the settled portions of Louisiana, most of them French and Spanish in culture and Catholic in religion, into the American Republic would fundamentally alter its character in ways the Constitution had not anticipated and the existing population had not consented to. They were not wrong about the constitutional question, which Jefferson had effectively resolved through executive action, rather than through the amendment process the Constitution specified. They were also making, though in a different register, an argument about the nature of the American Republic, about whether it was a compact among the existing states and their citizens, or a framework for the unlimited incorporation of new people and places that the 19th century would continue to argue about in forms that eventually produced the Civil War. The political implications of the Louisiana Purchase for American domestic politics were profound, and not all of them were what Jefferson had intended. Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. His party broadly represented the interests of agrarian society, of the states against the federal government, of a decentralized political order in which power resided in the localities rather than in Washington. The Louisiana Purchase was, in its execution, a remarkable exercise of centralized executive power. The president and two diplomats, acting without explicit constitutional authorization and without prior congressional approval, had committed the United States to a $15 million expenditure and had doubled its territory in a matter of weeks. The precedent it set for executive action in foreign policy was one that the Federalists noted with some bitterness, since it was precisely the kind of strong executive action that they had been accused of favouring and that Jefferson had spent years criticising. The slavery question, which would eventually destroy the political settlement of Jefferson's era, was present in the Louisiana Purchase from the beginning, though in a form that the participants were not yet fully prepared to see. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the legislative arrangement that tried to balance the admission of new slave and free states from the Louisiana Territory, and that Jefferson himself described in his old age as a fire-bell in the night, was the first eruption of the crisis that the Purchase had made inevitable. Doubling the territory available for American settlement meant doubling the territory over which the question of slavery's expansion would be fought, and the political arrangements that had managed the slavery question in the original 13 states were not adequate to a continental nation. The Louisiana Purchase gave the United States its continental destiny. It also gave the country that destiny's deepest and most destructive political crisis. The world that the Louisiana Purchase created was not immediately visible to the people who had created it. In the spring of 1803, Napoleon was already thinking about the coming war with Britain and the Italian campaigns that would dominate his military imagination for the next few years. Jefferson was already thinking about how to explore and settle the territory he had just acquired. Toussaint Louverture was dying in Fort-de-Joux, of cold and of the specific cruelty of being a man who had spent his life in tropical heat, imprisoned in an alpine winter, whose captors understood perfectly well what the combination would do to him. The people of Saint-Domingue were fighting the last phase of their revolution. Jean-Jacques Dessalines would declare Haitian independence on January 1st, 1804, less than a month after the Louisiana transfer ceremony in New Orleans, giving the new nation the name Haiti, the Taino word for the mountainous land that the Taino had inhabited before the Spanish came and destroyed them, a naming that was itself an act of historical acknowledgement and political commitment. The connection between the Haitian Revolution and the Louisiana Purchase is not always drawn explicitly in the American national narrative, but it is the connection that most directly explains why the purchase was possible. Napoleon's Louisiana was built on the assumption of a functioning Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue failed because of the Haitian Revolution. Without the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon does not sell Louisiana. Without the sale, the American interior remains hemmed in by a French-controlled Mississippi Valley, and the trajectory of American continental expansion is fundamentally altered. The United States that exists today, the continental nation with 50 states stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, was made possible, in a significant and direct causal sense, by the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, who rose in August 1791 and refused, through 13 years of extraordinary resistance, to accept the restoration of the system that had enslaved them, that their revolution produced as one of its consequences the expansion of a country that would continue to practice slavery for another 60 years is one of the more painful ironies of Atlantic history, and it is one that the full story of the Louisiana Purchase cannot honestly avoid. The Haitian state that emerged from the Revolution paid a heavy price for its existence. France, under pressure from the Haitian leadership's desire for diplomatic recognition and access to European trade, extracted an enormous indemnity, 150 million francs, later reduced to 90 million, as the price of French recognition of Haitian independence, a sum that Haiti finally finished paying in 1947, more than a century after the independence it was supposed to recognize. The United States did not recognize Haiti until 1862, under pressure of the Civil War that made the diplomatic complications of non-recognition less manageable than they had previously been, 60 years after the Revolution, whose consequences had directly enabled the Louisiana Purchase. These are not coincidences or historical footnotes. They are the specific way in which the consequences of what happened in Saint-Domingue played out across the following century, in ways whose full weight American history has only recently begun to properly acknowledge. The Lewis and Clark expedition that Jefferson organized to explore the Purchase territory was not a spontaneous response to the Purchase. Jefferson had been planning some form of Western exploration for years before the Purchase made it officially possible. As early as 1803, before Monroe had even left for Paris, Jefferson had secured a secret appropriation from Congress for an expedition to explore the Missouri River and find a route to the Pacific, framing it in terms of commercial intelligence rather than the territorial survey that it actually was, since the territory being surveyed was technically still French and then briefly Spanish before it became American. The expedition was, in its conception and its execution, a characteristically Jeffersonian project, combining the systematic scientific curiosity of the Enlightenment with the political and commercial purposes of the young republic, trying to understand what it had acquired. Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson's private secretary, and William Clark, Lewis's former commanding officer, led the Corps of Discovery from Camp Dubois near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, setting out in May 1804 with approximately 45 men in a keelboat and 2 pirogues. The journey that followed, up the Missouri through what is now Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, and North Dakota, across the Rocky Mountains through what is now Montana and Idaho, down the Columbia River system to the Pacific coast of what is now Oregon, and then back, covered approximately 8,000 miles and took 28 months. The journals that Lewis, Clark, and several other members of the expedition kept are among the most extraordinary documents in the history of American natural history, describing hundreds of plant and animal species previously unknown to European science, with a care and precision that reflects the Enlightenment scientific culture that Jefferson had specifically cultivated in Lewis's preparation for the expedition. The indigenous nations that the expedition encountered across its journey were the most important element of its political mission, and the Corps of Discovery's interactions with those nations, the Mandan and Hidatsa villages where they spent their first winter, the Shoshone whose horses they needed to cross the Rockies, the Nez Perce who sheltered them on their return journey, the dozens of other nations along the Missouri and Columbia drainages were conducted with a specific diplomatic agenda. Jefferson wanted to establish American sovereignty in the region and to establish trade relationships with the nations living there, conveying the message that the United States had replaced France as the political authority in the region and that American traders would be coming. The response of the indigenous nations to these messages varied from polite interest to skepticism to the specific hostility of the Lakota on the upper Missouri, who had been extracting tribute from river traffic for generations and were disinclined to recognize American authority over a river system they controlled in practice. What the expedition found, the Great Plains teeming with bison, the Rocky Mountain passes through which a transcontinental route might eventually be constructed, the Columbia River system reaching to the Pacific, was simultaneously an accurate report on the geography of the acquired territory and the foundation of the American imagination of the West as a place of unlimited potential. The journals that Jefferson eventually published created an image of the West that would sustain the emigration of millions of Americans across the following century, an image of abundance and possibility that was accurate in its geography and selective in its politics, describing a landscape of natural richness without adequately conveying the political reality that the landscape was already inhabited by people who had different ideas about its future. The Lewis and Clark expedition that Jefferson organized to explore the Purchase territory set out with a kind of confident American national spirit that the Purchase had generated and that the expedition's journals preserve in their descriptions of a landscape of extraordinary abundance and variety. The expedition's journals are one of the great documents of American natural history, recording with meticulous attention the plants and animals and geological formations and native peoples of the interior in terms that reflect the Enlightenment scientific culture that both Jefferson and Lewis and Clark embodied. They are also documents of the beginning of the American relationship to the West, the relationship that would eventually become Manifest Destiny, the ideological claim that the United States was providentially destined to occupy the entire continental landmass from Atlantic to Pacific, which the Louisiana Purchase provided both the territory and the psychological momentum to pursue. Manifest destiny is the idea whose development the Louisiana Purchase most directly enabled, and it is an idea whose consequences were experienced very differently, depending on who you were and where you were in the 19th century American West. For the hundreds of thousands of American settlers who moved west along the Missouri River and the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail, following the routes that Lewis and Clark and their successors had mapped, Manifest Destiny was the story of their own lives, of land claimed and farms established and communities built in places that the Atlantic seaboard of 1803 could barely imagine. For the indigenous nations of the West, Manifest Destiny was the name for a process of dispossession and destruction that the Louisiana Purchase had made possible, and that was conducted with a systematic violence whose scale and consequence the national mythology of Western expansion has consistently minimized. The specific question of what was actually purchased in 1803, what sovereignty France actually possessed over the Louisiana Territory, and what it was capable of transferring, was never fully resolved and never could be, because the European doctrine of discovery that gave France its claim to Louisiana was a legal fiction that indigenous reality consistently refuted. The Lakota and the Comanche and the Osage and the Crow and the dozens of other nations whose territories the Louisiana Purchase claimed did not acknowledge French sovereignty over their lands before 1803 and did not acknowledge American sovereignty after it. The process by which American sovereignty was eventually imposed on the Louisiana Territory's indigenous peoples was the 19th century's longest and most violent story, and it was set in motion, directly and causally, by the $15 million that James Monroe and Robert Livingston paid in Paris in May 1803. The physical legacy of the Louisiana Purchase is the map of the United States, but the Purchase's larger legacy is more expansive than any map can capture. It is the story of how a specific set of circumstances in 1803 set in motion a chain of consequences that transformed not just the United States, but the entire balance of power in the Atlantic world and eventually the world at large. The United States that emerged from the Louisiana Purchase was a different kind of state from the one that had existed before it. The constitutional republic of the founders had been conceived, at least in its Jeffersonian version, as an agrarian nation of independent farmers, a republic whose geographic size would be limited by the practical demands of representative government, which required that citizens be able to reach their representatives and that the representatives be meaningfully accountable to their constituents in ways that enormous distances made impossible in the communications technology of the period. Jefferson himself had written, in the Notes on the State of Virginia, about the virtues of a compact agrarian republic and the dangers of the commercial empire that he saw Britain representing. The Louisiana Purchase was, in one sense, a repudiation of this vision. It created a continental empire rather than a compact republic, and it did so through an exercise of executive power that Jefferson's own constitutional philosophy had defined as illegitimate. But Jefferson rationalized the contradiction by appeal to the agrarian vision itself. The Louisiana Territory was, in his conception, not the foundation of an empire, but the salvation of the yeoman farmer, an enormous reserve of agricultural land that would allow the Republic to remain agrarian for generations, because every son of every farmer who found his father's farm too small could move west and claim new land. The Republic could remain democratic and agrarian and independent as long as it had new land to absorb its growing population. Louisiana was the guarantee of the political character of the American Republic, purchased at the price of the constitutional consistency that the Purchase violated. This was the logic that Jefferson used to resolve the contradiction, and whether it was convincing as logic is a question that the subsequent history of American westward expansion, with its displacement of indigenous peoples, its extension of slavery, its eventual development not of Jeffersonian yeoman farming but of industrial agriculture and extractive capitalism, has answered in forms that Jefferson had not anticipated. The physical legacy of the Louisiana Purchase is the map of the United States, the shape of the country that most Americans carry in their heads as simply the given shape of the place they live in. The continental nation from sea to sea is in significant part the product of the deal that was struck between a French emperor abandoning a Caribbean empire and two American diplomats exceeding their instructions in Paris. The states that were eventually carved from the Louisiana Territory, Louisiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Wyoming and Montana, along with portions of Mississippi, Alabama and the Canadian border states, contain today approximately 90 million Americans. The cities on the Missouri River, the farms on the Great Plains, the oil fields of Oklahoma and Texas, the grain elevators of Kansas and Nebraska, the cattle ranches of Wyoming and Montana, all of these exist in the specific form they take because of the events of 1803. New Orleans, which was the prize that Jefferson sent Monroe to buy, became in the 19th century one of the most culturally distinctive cities in North America, a port city of enormous commercial importance, shaped by its layered French and Spanish and African and American heritages into something that has no close equivalent elsewhere in the United States. A city whose food and music and architecture and social culture still carry the specific marks of the centuries of colonial history that preceded the purchase. The jazz that emerged from New Orleans in the early 20th century and became one of America's most important contributions to global culture was a product of the specific cultural mixing that the city's colonial history had produced. The intersection of African-descended musical traditions, French and Spanish Creole culture, and the American commercial city that the 19th century had built around the port. It is, in a direct if very indirect sense, a product of the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase also shaped the American political tradition in ways that go beyond the specific states it created. The precedent it set for executive action in foreign policy, the capacity of the President and the Senate acting together to commit the country to transformative agreements without the prior approval of the full Congress, was one that subsequent presidents would invoke repeatedly in situations of varying degrees of necessity and legitimacy. The precedent it set for the acquisition of territory containing populations who had not consented to be incorporated into the American Republic, first the French and Spanish Creoles of Louisiana, then the indigenous peoples of the West, then the inhabitants of territories acquired after the Mexican-American War, established a pattern of American expansion that consistently outran the political theory of a republic founded on the consent of the governed. The night is settling in now, and the long story of the Louisiana Purchase has reached the end of the part that can be told in one sitting, though the consequences reach forward for another 2 centuries and are still, in various forms, present in the world. The deal was struck in Paris in the spring of 1803 between a French empire that had been broken by a revolution in the Caribbean that refused to fail and an American republic that needed a river it could not afford to lose. What was transferred for $15 million in a Paris notary's office was not merely land. It was the possibility of a continental nation. It was the future of a dozen American states. It was the end of the last significant French presence in the North American interior. It was the beginning of the American movement toward a Pacific coast that the people in the room could not quite see from where they were standing. The people who were not in the room, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue whose revolution had made it necessary, the indigenous peoples of the purchased territory whose sovereignty had not been consulted, the French soldiers who had died of the yellow fever in the mountains of Haiti, trying to restore an empire that was already dying. Their presence in the story is not less real for being absent from the document. History is full of rooms where the decisions were made about the people who were not in them, and the Louisiana Purchase is one of the clearest examples of that dynamic in the American national story. The deal that doubled America was made possible by people who got almost nothing from it, and the full accounting of what that means is still, in various ways, being worked out. Toussaint Louverture died in Fort de Joux in April 1803, a few weeks before the treaty was signed. He never knew that his revolution had made it possible. He never knew that the empire whose destruction he had accomplished had, in its death, transferred to the young republic, whose revolutionary ideals he had taken seriously a territory that would eventually make it the dominant power in the hemisphere. He died as he had lived, defiant, undefeated in the field, prisoner of a power that had feared him too much to let him live, and too little to understand what his resistance meant for everything that followed. The river is still there. The Mississippi still flows from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, through the heart of the continent, carrying the same water past the same flat plains and the same great bends that it carried in 1803, when it was the hinge on which the entire story turned. The city at its mouth is still there, still carrying its layered history and its streets, and its music and its food and its attitude toward the ordinary routines of life. And somewhere in a notary's archive in Paris, or perhaps in a French or American state archive, there is a document that says $15 million for all of it, and that changed the shape of the world it described. Let that settle around you now. The Mississippi is dark tonight, and the continent it drains is vast and various and complicated in ways that the men in the Paris office in 1803 could barely begin to imagine. But they opened a door that morning, and the world that walked through it is the world we are living in. Rest easy.